like to read? I love to read all types of literature that brings some kind of enlightenment and instruction, anything that can help us make our own lives easier. Do you have a special kind of reading that you prefer? Science in general. How many books do you read a month? 2 on average. Do you like literature? Yes, I do. What kind of books do you like? I really enjoy Machado de Assis. Do you like to read? Yes, I do. What kind of books do you read? Educational ones. More or less when I have time to read. How many a month? 4. Stupidity is not just a matter of human nature, but a phenomenon with predictable patterns and devastating consequences. The theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a resistor to Nazism, brought an unsettling perspective on stupidity. For him, the greatest danger lies not in people with bad intentions, but in those who, due to a lack of critical thinking, become easily manipulable. According to Bonhoeffer, stupidity is not an intellectual limitation, but rather a moral and social failure. The stupid individual does not reflect, does not question, and simply passively accepts what is imposed on them. The result is a cycle in which the rejection of knowledge strengthens conformity, making society increasingly vulnerable to manipulation. This analysis fits perfectly with what happened in Italy under the rule of Benito Mussolini. Italian fascism, between 1922 and 1943, was built on blind obedience, the intense use of propaganda, and the spread of fear. The regime exploited collective alienation to consolidate its power. When a population surrenders to moral negligence, it becomes incapable of seeing the abuses committed right in front of their eyes. Thus, Mussolini's government did not only rely on soldiers and weapons, but also on a society willing to accept atrocities in the name of order and the fatherland without question. Bonhoeffer warns us that power does not need the truth to maintain itself, only a sufficient number of people willing to close their eyes to reality, and therein lies the danger. Stupidity does not just obey orders, but defends them with fervor. Those who try to alert others to the risks find not only resistance from leaders, but also from the masses themselves. The passive acceptance of the dominant discourse suffocates any dissenting voice, amplifying the cycle of conformity and making it even harder to awaken collective consciousness. Mussolini's fascism demonstrated how dangerous it is when society abdicates the responsibility to think. The combination of fear and propaganda turns ordinary citizens into cogs in an oppressive system. Those who could have resisted, those who could have questioned, chose to embrace obedience, and what began as a political movement quickly became a social phenomenon in which rejecting knowledge was considered a virtue and submission a patriotic duty. Bonhoeffer saw the very collapse of the regime as inevitable when stupidity was cultivated on a large scale. Governments have long understood that stupidity can be a more effective tool than brute force. An authoritarian government does not need to repress everyone if it can influence a large part of the population to accept its orders without question. The lack of critical thinking makes people comply with absurd guidelines without noticing their contradictions. This phenomenon is not recent. From ancient empires to modern regimes, leaders have understood that it is much easier to govern a society that despises knowledge and embraces conformity. Dietrich Bonhoeffer observed that even intelligent people can act irrationally when inserted into certain power structures. When a charismatic leader or a strong institution sets the rules, collective alienation spreads like a virus. Moral negligence ceases to be an individual failure and becomes a systemic problem, as does the dominance of authoritarian ideas. Truth loses its value, and what really matters is the repetition of the official narrative, even when it makes no sense. Italian fascism was a clear example of this dynamic. Mussolini did not impose his vision solely through violence. He won the minds of the masses through propaganda and the suppression of dissenting thought, creating a culture where questioning was considered treason and blind obedience was seen as a proof of patriotism. This type of social structure is dangerous because it perpetuates ignorance in an organized way. In this way, the people themselves become complicit in their oppression, defending the system that keeps them submissive. Social stupidity not only sustains power, but strengthens it. Those who control the narrative shape reality and define what is right or wrong, and those who dare to challenge this structure risk being silenced, ridiculed, or even punished. This cycle repeats itself throughout history. Regimes fall, but control mechanisms remain. The rejection of knowledge never fully disappears because there are always interests that profit from an uninformed population. But Bonhoeffer was not the first to notice this pattern. Economic historian Carlo Cipolla presented a brutally realistic view of stupidity. According to him, we underestimate its destructive power because we erroneously believe that rationality always prevails. However, collective alienation causes people to act against their own interests without even realizing it. Cipolla identified stupidity as a factor of social destabilization capable of causing more damage than intentional evil. When moral negligence combines with a lack of critical thinking, absurdities become normalized. Cipolla's main idea is simple. The stupid harm themselves and others without any benefit, which makes them unpredictable and extremely dangerous. Bonhoeffer would agree. For him, stupidity was not just ignorance, but also an active refusal to see the truth. When a society rejects knowledge, it opens the door for authoritarian leaders and oppressive systems. And it is precisely at this point that power exploits the masses' lack of discernment to perpetuate itself. This dynamic becomes clear when we analyze Stanley Milgram's experiment, conducted in 1961. Milgram wanted to understand how far people would go in obeying orders, even if that meant hurting others. The results were shocking. Most participants continued administering fake electric shocks to another person simply because an authority figure told them to. The experiment revealed how blind obedience can lead ordinary people to commit cruel acts without question. The suppression of divergent thought turns submission into a normalized behavior. What Bonhoeffer and Milgram demonstrated is that stupidity is not an individual problem, but a large-scale social phenomenon. The more people refuse to think critically, the easier it becomes to manipulate them. Modern society, filled with distractions and disinformation, has only exacerbated this issue. Today, alienation does not require an authoritarian government to spread. It feeds on people's own neglect. If history teaches us anything, it is that social stupidity cannot be combated simply with information. Bonhoeffer, Cipolla, and Theodor Adorno all agreed that ignorance promoted by systems of power is not a result of a lack of access to knowledge, but of a conscious refusal to think critically. A society immersed in collective alienation not only accepts lies but defends them fervently. Conformity becomes a shield against the discomfort of doubt, and anyone who questions the dominant narrative is seen as an enemy. The corrosive force of stupidity lies in its resistance to change. Individuals subjected to a system of manipulation lose the ability to see beyond what is presented to them. Moral negligence becomes normalized, and the fear of challenging the order overtakes the responsibility to act. This is how totalitarian regimes grew stronger throughout history, and it is how many forms of oppression still persist. After all, a people that rejects knowledge does not need to be controlled by force. It keeps itself imprisoned. Adorno warned that intellectual passivity is one of the greatest dangers to democracy. When society gets used to blind obedience, authoritarianism becomes an inevitable consequence. Milgram's experiment proved this. Ordinary people with no history of cruelty were capable of inflicting suffering on others just because they were told to by an authority figure. The problem was not a lack of intelligence, but an inability to question power. As long as the suppression of critical thought is accepted without resistance, stupidity will continue to be a powerful tool in the hands of those who hold control. But resistance is possible. Adorno argued that critical thinking must be encouraged from an early age, so society does not fall into the trap of conformity. Bonhoeffer believed that the only way to combat stupidity was through intellectual autonomy and the courage to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Cipolla showed us that stupidity is not harmless. It has a real cost, and ignoring it only strengthens those who benefit from ignorance. Stupidity is not an isolated phenomenon, but a social virus. It spreads rapidly when it finds fertile ground. An environment where critical thinking is discouraged, dissenting opinions are repressed, and the rejection of knowledge becomes the norm. Bonhoeffer and Cipolla understood that stupidity does not need to be imposed by force. It is enough for society to embrace conformity and accept ignorance as something comfortable. Moral negligence expands when people stop questioning and begin obeying without reflecting on the consequences. The danger of social stupidity contagion is that it perpetuates itself. Those who surrender to collective alienation not only refuse to see reality, but also influence others to do the same. Critical thinking ceases to be a habit and becomes a rarity. When the majority gets used to repeating ideas without understanding their meaning, any form of divergent thought is seen as a threat. This process has been repeated countless times throughout history, and social media has only accelerated its spread. But if stupidity can spread, it also means it can be fought. Intellectual resistance begins when an individual chooses to think for themselves, even if it goes against the beliefs of the majority. When someone questions an imposed narrative and seeks knowledge beyond the superficial, they become a threat to the conformity cycle. Adorno warned that the only way to avoid authoritarianism is to encourage intellectual autonomy. The challenge, however, is that those who break away from collective alienation often face resistance, censorship, and even hostility. Modern society creates constant distractions to prevent people from developing deep reflection. Ready-made opinions and an incessant flow of entertainment serve to keep individuals in a passive state without seeing the world clearly. However, those who want to escape this cycle need to learn to filter information, question dominant discourses, and above all, cultivate intellectual humility. After all, no one is immune to manipulation, and recognizing this vulnerability is already an essential step to resist. One of the most worrying signs of a sick society is the intolerance of divergent thought. When questioning becomes a dangerous act, collective alienation reaches its peak. Authoritarian regimes always understood that the best way to maintain control is not only to impose a single vision, but to eliminate any possibility of contestation. The suppression of critical thought creates an environment where the rejection of knowledge is not only encouraged but becomes obligatory. Conformity, which was once a choice, becomes a necessity for survival. This phenomenon is not restricted to authoritarian governments. Even in societies that claim to be free, there is a constant effort to silence voices that challenge the dominant thought. Repression does not always need to be explicit. It is enough to ridicule or discredit those who dare to think differently. This strategy is effective because the fear of social isolation is a powerful factor. Few are willing to face the hostility of the majority. In this context, moral negligence is not only a sign of passivity, but a mechanism of self-preservation. Given the high cost of disagreeing, social media has aggravated this problem. Virtual lynching, cancel culture, and the creation of ideological bubbles have turned the internet into the perfect environment for imposing single narratives. Any attempt to present an alternative point of view can be crushed by a crowd that acts irrationally. This weakens critical thinking because instead of debating ideas, many prefer to silence others. Cipolla already warned that collective stupidity has a far more destructive impact than we realize. But there is a way out. Bonhoeffer believed that resistance begins when individuals question society, choosing to think for themselves. It has a price, but the cost of blind conformity is much higher. Bonhoeffer's teachings encourage the search for intellectual autonomy that goes beyond mere conformity. He believed that by confronting moral negligence and the rejection of knowledge, society could finally break free from the chains of collective alienation. Cipolla showed that stupidity is a destructive force present at all levels of society, exacerbated by a lack of critical thinking. Adorno, for his part, emphasized that true resistance arises from the ability to question the established order. These lessons serve as a beacon for those who wish to break the cycle of ignorance and embrace the freedom to think. The first step in transforming reality and challenging the power that feeds on conformity is a combination of courage and reflection. Breaking the cycle of social stupidity requires both an individual and collective commitment to truth and integrity. Each person must take an active role in the fight against collective alienation in the absence of critical thought. The constant practice of reflection and constructive dialogue disarms the forces of conformity that perpetuate ignorance. Moral negligence must be replaced by engagement that values ethics and knowledge. Bonhoeffer, Cipolla, and Adorno offer a clear vision of how intellectual resistance can transform society. By questioning imposed narratives, individuals can build a future where the rejection of knowledge is overcome by the power of consciousness. The turning point happens when one decides not to give in to the automatism of obedience, nor to the fear of what is different. The fight against conformity begins when the individual chooses not to allow collective alienation to define their identity. Each act of questioning, no matter how small, represents a blow against the hegemony of moral negligence and the rejection of knowledge. The revolution begins with the courage to break the silence and promote debate, even in the face of risks. At this point, the lessons of Bonhoeffer, Cipolla, and Adorno converge to show that true power lies in the freedom to think and act. Social transformation becomes possible when critical thinking replaces passivity and collective alienation gives way to conscious action. With the cycle of social stupidity challenged, the lessons of great thinkers serve as a guide. The search for a new paradigm intensifies, and intellectual resistance emerges as the key to opening a future where to be the starting point to challenge the cycle of ignorance. It requires a collective effort to foster a culture that values critical thinking. Every person who refuses to accept ready-made truths becomes a point of rupture in this control system. Collective ignorance only prevails when those who see the problem choose to remain silent. Therefore, combating alienation requires more than just knowledge. It requires courage. In our current world, many individuals are unwilling to challenge the status quo. They prefer to accept what is most convenient or comfortable, regardless of the consequences. The reason for this reluctance to question can often be linked to fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of facing uncomfortable truths, or fear of social exclusion. But as history has shown, the consequences of ignoring the need for critical thought are disastrous. This is where the teachings of Bonhoeffer, Cipolla, and Adorno converge. To challenge the ignorance that sustains totalitarianism, we must foster a culture that promotes intellectual autonomy and open debate. One of the key lessons from these thinkers is the recognition that individuals, especially in societies governed by authority, must cultivate intellectual independence. This intellectual independence is not simply about acquiring knowledge. It is about having the courage to question the sources of information and the narratives we are presented with. As society becomes more fragmented by misinformation and the noise of endless distractions, we must learn how to filter the truth and seek out independent sources of knowledge. Intellectual humility, the willingness to acknowledge that we may be wrong or unaware, becomes the foundation of genuine resistance. This resistance is not just for intellectuals or academics, it is for everyone. It is about taking responsibility for the information we consume, and most importantly, the information we spread. Each time we make the choice to question, we undermine the systems of manipulation that thrive on collective ignorance. We reclaim the right to think critically and independently, ensuring that our thoughts and actions are driven by knowledge and ethical responsibility rather than blind conformity. The digital age, with its vast network of information, has given us unprecedented access to knowledge. Yet at the same time, it has created an environment where misinformation spreads faster than ever, and where the lines between truth and falsehood are often blurred. Social media, with its algorithms designed to maximize engagement, often rewards outrage, confirmation bias, and emotional responses over thoughtful analysis. This can make it easy to fall into the trap of passive consumption, absorbing information without critically engaging with it. Thus, the challenge today is not just to inform people, but to engage them in a deeper way, encouraging them to reflect on what they are being told. It is about fostering a society where people do not just accept information, but actively question it and seek truth. It requires individuals to reject the ease of passive acceptance and instead take ownership of their intellectual journeys. The lessons of Bonhoeffer, Cipolla, and Adorno remind us that the true danger lies not in the individuals who hold power, but in the willingness of ordinary people to accept whatever narrative is presented to them without question. The willingness to follow blindly is what sustains the systems of control. The antidote to this danger is the cultivation of independent thought, the courage to resist the pressures of conformity, and the strength to stand up for truth, even when it is uncomfortable. In the end, the resistance to social stupidity is not about being right all the time. It is about maintaining the courage to continue seeking truth and engaging in meaningful dialogue. It is about creating a culture that values reflection over passivity that encourages questions instead of blind obedience, and that fosters intellectual humility over arrogance. By doing so, we can begin to dismantle the systems that thrive on collective ignorance and work towards a more informed, more just society. As we come to the end of this journey through the dangers of collective ignorance and the importance of critical thinking, let us remember the words of those who have illuminated the path of intellectual resistance. It is up to each one of us to stand firm in the face of conformity, to challenge the narratives that seek to manipulate us, and to embrace the courage to question. With that, we close this chapter of reflection and awakening. Stay vigilant, stay inquisitive, and above all, stay true to the pursuit of knowledge. This is the being of knowledge, where the truth is never taken for granted, but always sought. Until next time, keep questioning, keep evolving, and keep resisting. Signed, the being of knowledge.